Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am Game Master Bloodworth, and as you can see by the graphics, I am going to delve into probably a very sticky topic here. So, which TTRPG will be crowned the D&D killer in 2025? So, this is something that has been, a concept that has been bandied about amongst our hobby in general, uh, mostly since January of 2023, following the OGL crisis, and a lot of game systems, whether already released or projected to release within 2024 or 2025, have had this label placed on them as being the next, either the next big game, which is fine, or the next D&D killer, which I certainly have some issue with that label because it's oftentimes being put onto a game system without a true understanding of what Dungeons and Dragons is. And so that's kind of my take with this. I'm going to go into much greater detail, but to begin off with, so starting in 2023, January of 2023, in the OGL, we heard about Kobold Press's Tales of the Valiant, which was originally Project Black Flag. Then MCDM and Daggerheart and Shadow Dark and Pathfinder Second Edition, even Castles and Crusades had their sales numbers really explode during that first, let's say, 10 to 12 months following the OGL crisis, and many of those already publishers that have been out have experienced greater growth of their sales and such, which is a phenomenal thing. I think it's great overall for the entire hobby that all of these companies are experiencing higher sales. But the label of D&D killer, I think, needs to be unpacked a little bit more. And in order to do that, you need to have a greater understanding of what Dungeons and Dragons is. And so I am going to give you my take, and you're welcome to agree or disagree, but this is where I'm coming from. So for me, Dungeons and Dragons, and actually I'll switch views because I've had some people say they like the full view. Dungeons and Dragons to me is a 50-year-old legacy brand with 50 years of name recognition. And so to suggest that a newer game system is going to be the D&D killer, there's no way that a newer game system, and even that includes game systems that have been around for 30 years, there's no way that they're going to be able to remove that brand recognition, and that, or the branding, just the impact of the branding itself. You will see D&D slapped on, T-shirts and cups and dice and games, other games unrelated to tabletop role-playing games, as well as other other types of medium that I will go into. But so there's no killing the brand and the legacy recognition that Dungeons and Dragons have. That will always exist. Even if there is a total shutdown of any product bearing the D&D logo on it, it could take decades going beyond that total shutdown, that people will still remember the name Dungeons and Dragons, the brand Dungeons and Dragons. So there's no killing that. Um, Not even the company that owns the IP can kill the brand and the name recognition, because that all belongs to us. That belongs in our memories. And so it will take a long, long time before that fades from popular memory. Then there is the tabletop role playing game Dungeons and Dragons. So, again, a game system that has 50 years of legacy. And to beat that, or to kill that off, is a much easier thing to do than killing off its brand and name recognition, because all you have to do is to create a better system that becomes more popularly played in the wild, in the, at conventions and at local game stores and at home tabletops. All right. And this really goes to the concept of market share, the reality of market share. And I'm not talking about just strictly share, sales, but I'm talking about actual gameplay. And I'm talking about the actual game system, the tabletop role playing game system of Dungeons and Dragons. Um, I know they like to use the phrase "the world's greatest role playing game," um, but that's a highly subjective thing. Number one, number two, great in what is a question that has to be asked, and will never be answered, obviously, because the company making that argument, excuse me, the company making that argument will never actually put it into that kind of a description, right? They're not going to say, oh, well, we just simply mean sales. Um, Overall, that might be possible, but they don't release their sales figures, so you have no way of knowing. Um, the greatest, mechanically speaking, it's actually probably never been really known as the best of game systems around. That's why it's gone through so many different iterations and homebrews and such. And that's similar to all other tabletop role playing game. That's why I said it's very subjective to say, oh, well, this is the world's greatest. Um, that is something that in the eyes of the beholder, all right, and the experience of the individual gamer, or the individual gaming table is going to make that determination. Um, then, of course, there is, Dungeons and Dragons in video games, and we've seen, Baldur's Gate 3 was a very impressive showing of it, but, they've been doing video games for Dungeons and Dragons going all the way back to the 1980s or early 90s. They've had cartoons and movies, and they've had several movies, not just the one, like a lot of people, or two. There have been about 4 or 5 movies that have had that D&D label on them. And for the most part, unfortunately, none of them have been truly successful. So, going back to that, the world's greatest doesn't apply to their movies, that's for darn sure. They have, they've had television series, primarily the cartoon. They have streaming series, primarily Critical Role's Vox Machina and Stranger Things. And then they've had novels and comics. And the novels have been, for the most part, a, a a major component of their branding. Many of their world building concepts came through novelization, as well as some of the most iconic characters have come through the novelization as well, and that seems to be something that I think Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro really has kind of overlooked, is the impact of novels on creating sub IPs within the broader Dungeons and Dragons. So, this is like Dragonlance and Ravenloft and, many of the other, back in the day, the Greyhawk Adventures series of novels and so on. So, it's been pretty much left behind, in my opinion, that they don't really focus on that. Is there a Dungeons and Dragons comic out there? I'm not even sure if there still is one. So these are all of the things that Dungeons and Dragons is, as the big umbrella over all of these different iterations of the brand and the name recognition. And so to say, well, this particular TTRPG, whether it be an OSR or an indie, and I'll get into that as well, is going to be the D&D killer. Well, I think it can only be looked at as far as it being the D&D killer of comparing tabletop role-playing game system versus tabletop role-playing game system, and then looking to see how they are performing against one another, as far as market share is concerned, but more importantly, as far as it actually being played and seen in, in real play out there, whether it be at your individual table or at a gaming store or at a convention, as well as on the various VTTs that are out there. What is the probability of finding active games in various areas? And that is going to ebb and flow over time, but I think that that is someplace where the OSR and indie game spheres can collectively start to take over that market share, and all they have to do is become greater than 51% to then say, well, market share wise, collectively they're beating it. Now I know that there'll be some that will say, oh well, you have one game system versus an entire, multiple numbers of games publishers that are competing against the one, the one giant company, and that one giant publisher, I should say. And that is true in the sense of just sheer numbers comparison, but that's not going to mean the same thing as far as influence is concerned. And again, I'm going to get into, who can truly compete and possibly take over that share, because no company is even within, like, no individual publisher is within, percentage wise, that market share point. It's only in their collective that they start to get towards that 49% or so of the market share. So let's talk about who is competing both in the OSR and the indie. And I'm obviously not going to mention every single one, but you do have Paizo primarily with their Pathfinder 2. You have Chaosium with primarily Call of Cthulhu, which is probably name recognition wise globally is probably right along with that. You have Warhammer, which has both Warhammer Fantasy and you have Warhammer 40K. The Warhammer wargaming is actually much, much larger than Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro's Dungeons and Dragons tabletop. Tremendously larger. As a matter of fact, Games Workshop is probably worth more than Hasbro as a whole. And again, we have to remember that we're talking about, as tabletop role-playing games are concerned, we're talking about a niche within a niche, right? We're a much smaller population of game players compared to board gamers for certain, and compared to war gamers. We're still a much smaller population compared to those two different aspects of tabletop gaming as a whole. And we're literally dwarfed, all of us are literally dwarfed by video gaming. There's no comparison whatsoever there. So as I was mentioning, so you have Paizo, you have Chaosium, you have Free League, you have Modifius, you have Palladium, you have Troll Lord Games, and many, many, many others. And all of these small ones that have been sprouting up over this last year and a half, let's say, or since January of 2023, and I mentioned those earlier on, they're outcropping too. So declaring a new game system as being a D&D killer really doesn't do that game system or that creator any real service, in my opinion. I think that I think it's meant to be a comment, but there's a reason why none of them, at least I've never seen any creator out there, not just like accept that crown if it's falsely given to them, but they actually reject that idea that that their game is a D&D killer. And there's a reason why. I think that they understand more so than perhaps those that are trying to give them that crown. They understand that they can't possibly compete with the brand and name recognition that has 50 years of legacy to it. So that's, first of all, that's just a practical way of looking at it, that there's no way that they can get there. They're, in some cases they will say, I've created what I think is a better way to do D&D, and they're being like very gracious in saying that. But even very few will actually say, no, my game system is just better. It's just better than. I think the other reason why is that and I'm going to say this, and I'm sure a lot of people in the OSR, which I really do include myself in. A lot of people in the OSR are going to push back on this idea. But can you truly be a D&D killer if your game system is derivative of Dungeons and Dragons? And my argument is no. I would say that no D&D derivative OSR or well, they're all OSR. There's very few independent games out there that are derivative of Dungeons and Dragons. So amongst the OSR, you really can't put that crown on your head and say you're a D&D killer if 70, 80, 90% of your game system is based on Dungeons and Dragons. Now, You might have more gameplay out there than Dungeons and Dragons, particularly 5th edition, has out there when I do that comparison, because 5th edition is not considered OSR. So even if there's a lot of AD&D first edition, second edition, or OD&D being played in a convention, let's say, those numbers aren't included with Dungeons and Dragons. That also includes 5th edition. They're separated from. So when you have a lot of gameplay being done by Shadow Dark and Castles and Crusades, and maybe some of these others that are D&D derivative game systems, you'll lump them in with AD&D first edition, second edition, OD&D, D&D BECME, and that is in competition with 5e, and a number of game sessions going on. So they can exceed the numbers of gameplay being done, but they still can't really claim that they're a D&D killer if they're a derivative of Dungeons and Dragons. So that's another reason why I think many of these other creators won't accept that crown, and in some cases they outright reject it. They were like, no, and some create their game systems without any intention of being a D&D killer, so they don't even broach that conversation with, or contemplate even discussing it, because it wasn't their intention. They're just making a game that they enjoy playing, and they want to put it out there for others to see if they enjoy playing it as well. So now I'm going to get to the point of who can kill it, and in what way can they kill it. And the short answer of that is that only Hasbro can kill Dungeons and Dragons. And even then, they don't have the ability to kill the name recognition of it. They don't have the ability to kill the memory that many of us have going back 50 years. So that will be a long-lasting thing, even if they shelve D&D as both a brand and as a tabletop role-playing game. They never sell their license, to have licensing deals for video games or TV or streaming. If they just completely shut it down, the legacy of D&D will still last for many decades. The players that are playing their printed copies of D&D are still going to have their books and still continue using their books for many years or even decades, going beyond the complete shutdown. So Hasbro doesn't have the ability to kill the name recognition, or even they could stop the branding, but not the name recognition. They can kill the tabletop RPG that is Dungeons and Dragons, and in many cases, I think that their steps seem to be showing that that is, potentially their intention to, because they want to bring their current player base over to their video game and their VTT and so on, and to the digital market of D&D branding. But that is likely the area in which other publishers, other creators can actually defeat Dungeons and Dragons, the tabletop role-playing game, by making a better product that is both better received and played more often. And that is across all different modes of play, whether it's in your home, at a gaming store, at a convention, or on virtual tabletops across the spectrum of all of the virtual tabletops that are out there. So that's the one area that I think is very possible for a game system to beat D&D. Killing, I think, is the wrong term to use because no one's really looking to kill off Dungeons and Dragons. They're looking to, if anything, to compete at an equal or better level of exposure to Dungeons and Dragons. And again, that will never translate, at least not for several decades, will that translate to greater name recognition. But there is definitely a separation between name recognition and quality, name recognition and playability. I have often used the analogy of comparing Dungeons and Wizards of the Coast Dungeons and Dragons, particularly 5th edition, post 2017, 2019, as the McDonald's hamburger of tabletop role-playing games. And, what that's saying is that, yes, it does sell more than anyone else, and yet no one eating that hamburger is going to choose that burger over any other fast food franchise's hamburger, matched equally 1-to-1. Everyone else's tastes better, and that's not even I don't even think that's a subjective thing. I think that it's a pretty obvious thing that the only reason why that the McDonald's regular hamburger sells in the quantities that it does is name recognition and branding, and just the locations that they have, thrown about. So it's like, and Wizards of the Coast has a very, very similar, a very, very similar setup where they have the name recognition and they have location, right? You can go into, any number of gaming or comic related stores, or, even the big box stores such as like Walmart or Target or whatever, and you'll find D&D on the shelf, and you're going to be much harder pressed to find OSR or independent game publishers having their books in those same stores. But that trend is going to begin to change as Wizards of the Coast and primarily Hasbro abandoned, which I believe that they are, abandoned the tabletop, hardcover, books on there. I mean, they've ended their relationship with I want to say Penguin Press. I'm not sure if I'm getting that precisely right. This is unscripted, but they've severed ties with their publisher, their primary publisher for their hardbacks and their and their novelization and such like that. And they've come out with this new what they call the the Forever Edition or the Infinite Edition or whatever. It's the 2024 edition of it, and I honestly don't think that they will ever produce another hardcover Core 3 books again, because that's not what they're envisioning for the future of Dungeons and Dragons. So when we look at our niche here of tabletop role-playing games, and we're talking about running games using the books. Um, I think that it's highly possible that some publisher out there will exceed what what Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro are doing with their tabletop role playing game Dungeons and Dragons. I think that it will. I've already seen the decline in the number of game sessions at conventions from where it was in the past. Um, it certainly has declined with all of these other game systems getting more exposure. And I think the player base is looking for someplace else to spend their money, and that's another thing that I believe Hasbro has really hurt their own product line, their own IP, in that they've driven large numbers of their consumer base away with some of their actions over time. So that's pretty much it. That's where I kind of stand on it. I would not declare any game system as a D&D killer, other than the fact that, or beyond my own personal liking of certain game systems. So I will always play a Castles and Crusades or a Shadow Dark. I'm looking heavily into DC 20 right now to see how much that game will potentially become something that I run and play. Um, Not quite sure. I'll probably just get it to have some ideas, and pull some ideas from it. But for the most part, the chances of me going back to playing 5e or next to nothing. The chances of me moving on and taking a look at uh, the D&D 2024 core rule books, virtually zero. Um, I mean, there would have to be some major, major changes, and I can almost guarantee that it's zero. But looking at these other games that are coming out there, that is what I think is the healthiest thing for our hobby as a whole, is to get out there and go to conventions, go to gaming stores, run different systems, or open yourself to playing different systems out there. And it doesn't have to be just one game system that is the D&D killer. It could be the collection of all of these great games that are out there, that if we just expand what we're playing, we've kind of beaten the 5e Wizards of the Coast market share, and that's where I think it's best to kind of set your sights on, is to avoid using that. This is the next great, this is the next big D&D killer that's coming out there. I don't think it does any help for that creator with his or her game system to label it as such, and that's why you never hear them say that as well. I think it's much too nuanced, and there's just much too complex to try to explain what does killed mean, what is D&D, because like I said, many people don't think of it in they think of it as one thing, one entity, when it really is a number of things at the same time. So I look forward to your comments, and agree with me, disagree with me, whatever. I'm glad to have the conversation with you, and as always, I look forward to seeing you on a gaming screen sometime soon, at a gaming table at a convention, even better. And if you hadn't considered subscribing, please consider subscribing. Uh, like the video if you liked it. Dislike the video if you didn't like it. But please leave your comments in there because I would love to have that interaction with you. More so than anything else, I really do appreciate comments. And you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.